Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our event called Divest, Defund, and Regulate the Industrial Livestock Sector. This event is being organized by Feedback and Synergie Animal. Unfortunately, my colleague from Feedback could not be here today, so they'll be joining us online. Today we have as speakers Alma Castejon Davila, who will be talking about a new report they're launching about the role of methane emissions and the relation with livestock. Joining us as well is Milena Bernal, the coordinator of the Unsustainable Livestock Campaign at Global Forest Coalition. And online we have Martin Baumann from Feedback Global. And my name is Meryl Vandermark. I work with Synergie Animal, which is an animal protection organization working in the Global South. And both Synergie Animal, Feedback, and Global Forest Coalition are member of a campaign called the Stop Financing Factory Farming campaign, which is asking development banks to stop financing factory farming because of the impacts it has on the climate and on the sustainable development goals. I think the internet is not working, so the presentation's it's not working either. I'd just like to run through some of the key impacts that industrial livestock has. It impacts, of course, the climate. Industrial livestock contributes at least 14.5% to all greenhouse gas emissions. And depending on how you weight methane, I'm sure you'll speak more about that, it's significantly more. It also represents about a third of all methane emissions. And the sector consumes a large chunk of the budget that we have if we want to stay within a scenario of 1.5% degree increase of the temperature. Research shows that if we continue with business as usual, by 2050, the industrial livestock sector will be using up 80% of the allowable budgets that we have. So that leaves almost no room for other emissions. The industrial livestock sector is also the major driver of deforestation, especially of tropical forest deforestation, whether it is for the production of feed, like soy and maize to feed chicken and pigs, but also, of course, for pasture, which is especially in the Amazon, by far the largest driver of deforestation. And this is putting the resilience of ecosystems at risk. It also contributes a lot to pollution. The production of feed, like soy and maize, uses a lot of pesticides and fertilizers, and the livestock itself produces a lot of manure. And this pollutes the water of the communities around these production systems. It pollutes the air and, of course, the soil as well. Industrial livestock also has a huge impact on human health. We are still living in a zoonotic pandemic, and the sector is an ideal breeding ground for new zoonotic diseases. UNEP has warned us about this, that it is likely that new zoonotic diseases will appear, and the livestock sector does contribute immensely to that. It is also impacting us because it uses large amounts of antimicrobials, and it's creating more and more antimicrobial resistance, which will impact the way that we care for our own human health. Furthermore, diets that are very heavy on red processed meat are also unhealthy and can contribute to heart diseases, to diabetes, and some types of cancer. The livestock sector is also contributing to social inequality and inequity. The sector is notoriously for being involved in land grabs and causing social conflicts. It expels people from their own territories. Small-scale farmers can't compete with the sector. It's heavily integrated, and the competition is very fierce, so they often don't find a way to survive from their traditional livelihoods. And that impacts food sovereignty, not only of local and traditional communities, of indigenous communities, but also of nearby urban areas that often depends heavily on the production of food from small-scale farmers around those areas. We've seen during the pandemic that in places where there are many small-scale farmers, food systems are far more resilient, and where they're very dependent on the import of processed products and of livestock products, they're far less resilient. And finally, and definitely not last, the industrial livestock sector is tremendously cruel to animals. Animals are kept in small cages where they can't stand up and stretch their legs. They often suffer mutilations. They are kept in berry beds, air conditioned, suffering high ammonia concentrations, standing in their own feces their whole lives. It is a very inhumane way of treating animals. So for all of these reasons and many more, which we will hear more about from our speakers today, it's important that we stop expanding the livestock sector and stop defunding and divesting it. A number of high-level scientific reports have called for this, from IPBS to the IPCC, the FAO, and Dasgupta reports. They all show the urgency of shifting our diet systems. So that's why we're making this call for finance to shift to more sustainable practices. We were hoping to have an indigenous speaker here today, but he has not found his way yet to this place yet. So before passing, as he's not here yet, I'll pass the word first to Milena Bernal.
Thank you, Mariel, and thank you to you all who are joining us today in this conversation that actually for us is really important and crucial, especially during these climate negotiations, because basically the solutions that countries are proposing are really linked with the problems that we want to discuss today. I just want to highlight, for example, the case of Colombia, where I am from. We receive millions of dollars to stop deforestation, and basically we continue producing or funding the same problem that is causing the deforestation. So industrial and in general, agriculture, extensive agriculture is what is really, it's the root of the problem. So today, and just following what Meryl said previously, I want to share with you the campaign that 7 organizations starts almost 2 years ago. The organizations that, well, basically we are really committed to work for a transformation of the food production system. We are 7 organizations: Global Forest Coalition, Feedback UK, Bank Information Center, Instituto Mayra, World Animal Protection, International Accountability Project, Friends of the Earth, and Synergia Animal. And the objective of our campaign is to request, to demand public banks. I think this is not working well. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, to the public banks that stop financing the factory farming. Why we are requesting this? Basically, because we already identified there are many causes, there are many problematics that the industry is basically boosting. We know that around of 77% of the agricultural land around the world is used to raise animals or to plant food to feed them. Basically, is the land is not used to plant food for ourselves. It's being used to plant food for animals that later we will eat in a bad conditions as well. But it's not only this. There are many problems that we have identified with the communities that we are working with. For example, we identified that there are organizations trying to fight against corporations, big corporations, in countries such as Brazil, in countries such as Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and of course many countries in the Africa region. Just to highlight one of the examples that we already identified in Mexico, there are cases that basically the communities are already discussing, are debating in the constitutional courts, in the courts of the country, because they identify that companies are impacting their rights, the rights to access to water, the rights to access to food, the right to access to a sustainable environment. So in the case of Mexico, for example, in the Yucatan province, the companies are expanding the business mainly to produce pork that will be later exported to countries such as US or China. But this is not only the case that, of course, we identified. There are many cases, and one of these cases is also taking place in Brazil. We identified in 2021 that the Marfrig was requesting to the Inter-American Development Bank a loan of $43 million to continue expanding the production and to boost Brazilian beef operations. So as campaign, we worked together, and after many efforts to send a letter of around 260 organizations and to raise also social media awareness about what was happening, and after to talk with many local movements and local indigenous organizations that are really worried about what was happening there. We got not directly a response from the bank, but we noticed that the bank just published and as a news that the loan was just stopped for environmental reasons. So we think that this is the result of this is incredible amount of efforts among all the organizations and among all civil society, and that Brazil needs to just be aware that what the industrialized sector is causing in Brazilian forest. This happened in 2021, and now we are also trying to work around another project that is Northern in Mexico. Basically, they are requesting $30 million to the IDB Invest, just to continue, improving like facilities for pig farms, for production operations. This is a project that is still being under negotiation, and we hope to also continue working with organizations to stop basically what they are requesting for. So what we are trying to do now with the campaign is just to work with communities, raise awareness, making more people involved and making more people aware about what are the impacts of the industry. Many organizations really are facing the challenges that these that the companies basically are putting in their territories, but there are more discussions that needs to be or that we need to continue doing in these spaces, basically because we know that it's not only the problematic of the companies going to the territories or going to implement their projects. Basically, there are many other problems related to the access to land, are problems related to the access to rights for indigenous peoples, women who are not recognized as real actors of change. And of course, there are also another problems of how the banks are approaching their policies. The policies they already have are really interesting, but are not useful to tackle the problematics that the same financial institutions are causing. So we are just advocating to put gender rights in the court, to put indigenous people's rights in the court, to really implement policies that can be effective, that cannot be contradictory between what some countries are trying to do and between what basically the money is going for. So it's part of what we are doing nowadays. And we just hope that more organizations can join these efforts and that we can get a really collaborative and open dialogue with these institutions that we know that are also interested to improve, at least in their possibilities, the climate action. So well, I had just pictures that I wanted to share, but cannot do it. But well, you are also welcome to join our campaign. Later we will share the link with you.
Thank you so much, Milena. Just to, yeah. It's working? No, it is, yeah. Thanks so much, Milena, for the presentation of the Stop Financing Factory Farm. And as you mentioned, the success that was achieved with the IDB, the blocking a loan to Marfrig from the IDB, I think is a very important precedent. And hopefully we will see more of these decisions by development banks. Research from the Stop Financing Factory Farm campaign has indicated that in the past 10 years, development banks have poured almost $5 billion into meat and dairy companies around the globe. So they have a huge, they're fueling the impacts that this sector has. So now I'd like to pass the word to Alma Castrejon-Davila, Senior Campaigner at Changing Markets, who will talk a bit more about the impacts of methane and the link with industrial livestock.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you so much. Yes, as Marel mentioned, I work with Changing Markets, and we've been working. I just wanted to give you a little bit of introduction of why we are, or background of why we're working on the methane emissions from the livestock industry. At Changing Markets, we've been working on this for the last year. We've been doing a campaign to rapidly cut methane emissions from the livestock industry. And one of the reasons is, I don't know if you've noticed, but in the past year, we have been seeing quite a lot of attention being put on the reduction of methane emissions. And this is because these reductions can actually help us meet our climate targets and stay within the 1.5 limit. The reason why this is the case is because methane is a greenhouse gas that it's 80 times more potent than CO2, and it only stays in the atmosphere for about 10 to 12 years. So it gives us a great opportunity to actually reduce the temperatures within this decade. However, when we start looking at which industries, man-made emissions, where do these come from, we start seeing that the livestock industry, for example, is the largest source of methane emissions, contributing to 32% of global emissions. And so it gives us a good idea of why we need to be looking at this industry in order to make these rapid cuts. However, there is a lack of action from both governments and companies. We have not seen any policies or action plans to actually reduce these methane emissions. If you remember, I don't know if you've were able to follow last year, the US and the EU introduced the Global Methane Pledge. And this year, they have been actually giving some updates on that. However, agriculture and livestock continues to be a blind spot for any kind of policies, introduction of policies, or general national introduction of policies. We have not only been focusing on the government and the companies, but we've also been looking at what is it that investors are interested in, what are their perceptions. So last summer, we published an investor briefing to actually understand what were the investor perceptions, so get insights on their perceptions on how the meat and industry will address their climate impacts or climate footprint. We developed a survey of 200 respondents within the investor community. And the findings that we had were that over 80% of investors are concerned that climate change will pose material risks to meat and dairy industry related investments. Over 80% of investors also say that a lack of climate mitigation could lead to stranded assets within the industry. And more than half of these investors said that they are concerned about climate change, and the effects in the industry, but they are not quite doing anything to address those concerns. We also have that 95% of these investors want to see methane emissions being addressed alongside carbon emissions. And 83% of these investors also said that they would like to see companies reporting of these emissions. I have touched briefly of why it's important to address methane emissions, the footprint of livestock, but actually I wanted to actually give you a little case study of how big the problem it is and how these companies are feeling the climate crisis. So today, alongside our partners, Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, we launched a report that calculated the methane emissions of 5 meat companies and 10 of the largest dairy companies. And a little taste of that is that we found that if we combine the emissions of these companies, this can be slightly larger than the emissions of Germany. If we were to combine these companies' emissions as well, and we were consider them as a country, they will be the 10th largest emitting GHG emitting country in the world. And the emissions of these companies as well, when combined, can be larger or exceed those of the oil and gas companies such as ExxonMobil, Shell, and BP. So I wanted to actually, for the audience that is here, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, turn it to you, and see how many of you think that these companies are reporting their emissions, just in general, and especially scope 3 emissions, their supply chain. If you can just raise your hand. Nobody. Okay, that's good. In the research that we had, we actually saw that 9 out of the 15 companies that we investigated, they are either not reporting their emissions or they're not fully reporting their scope 3 emissions or their supply chain emissions. Another question that I wanted to ask you is, how many of you think that these companies are reporting separately their methane emissions? Okay, yeah, the answer is correct. None of them are doing it. And this is actually quite shocking because this is where most of the emissions of these companies are in the methane emissions. So what we're looking here is that we have these global companies that are huge emitters. They are not reporting their emissions, or if they are, there is a lack of transparency. They do not produce all of the data in a public manner or in a standardized manner. So it's not consistent year by year within the company or amongst companies. It's not very consistent, so it's hard to follow. And it is also a sector that is quite vulnerable to climate impacts. We are seeing that they are big producers of carbon emissions and methane emissions, but they're also equally dependent of a stable climate conditions. So this is something that we need to be putting the pieces of the puzzle together and really get investors to keep this in mind whenever they are engaging with these companies they are invested in. Just to leave you with some final thoughts, the climate impacts are already being felt right now by the industry. It's not something that is going to happen in the future. It's something that it is happening right now. The industry is right now at a crossroads, and they actually are in a situation where transformation is inevitable. They either continue on a path of business as usual, either keep producing the emissions that they do, and seeing themselves losing profits and production, or they actually need to think about going on a path of supporting food systems transformation. And I think investors have a really good role to play on which way these companies go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alma, for the presentation of this very worrying data. The fact that a lot of investors do care, but then the companies don't report the information, that's a really problematic issue for investors that do want to contribute to change. I would like to pass the word to Martin Baumann, who's joining us online, senior campaigner at Feedback Global, and who will make an argument of why the sector needs to be regulated. Martin, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much to the other speakers for fantastic talks. Let me just share my screen quickly. Fantastic. Can you all see that okay? It looks like it's coming up. You can see, that's great. So yeah, hi, so I'm Martin Bowman, and I'm here from Feedback. We're a food sustainability NGO based in the UK and the Netherlands. And we have over a decade's experience of sort of campaigning on sustainable food issues, including industrial livestock, which we'll be talking about today. So I'm going to start off with the question, why do we need to regulate big livestock? So Meryl did a great job on it, and the other speakers have done a great job of sort of laying out some of the damaging impacts of the livestock industry. But I'd just like to zoom in again briefly on the emissions impacts to show how essential it is. This isn't an optional bolt-on that we tackle meat. It's an absolutely essential part of the picture. So if global trends continue, by 2030, the global meat and dairy industry alone will be using up almost half of the emissions budget we can emit to stay within a safe 1.5 degrees of global heating by 2030. And this basically leaves almost no space in the emissions budget for every other sector in the global economy, basically putting out of reach the 1.5 degree target. So it's absolutely essential that we reduce meat production and consumption. And this has led Hans Pörtner, a scientist and co-chair of the IPCC, to say that without reducing and cutting down on meat consumption and the associated high-intensity agriculture systems, we will not be able to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. That is very clear. So this really lays out in black and white the situation that we're facing. And part of the reason for this is that extensive studies have found that even the lowest emissions meat and dairy is usually far higher emitting than most plant-based equivalent proteins. So there are hard limits on how much you can decarbonize meat without dietary shifts. And so zooming in, the worst of these, the companies that we're talking about today, industrial livestock, just to define what that means. So to clarify, we're not talking here about small scale livestock production like pasture in the global south. We're talking about intensive mass-produced livestock here, unsustainably supplying primarily in rich countries overconsumption of meat. So just to highlight that this is a regionally stratified problem that's particularly concentrated in the global north in rich countries. We're just consuming far too much meat, and that uses up a vastly unfair share of the world's land and emissions budget. So some countries are beginning to wake up to this fact, and we know that we need governments to get involved in helping incentivize these shifts, because from the current data, we've seen that individual behavior change is not going to drive these shifts at a fast enough pace. So governments need to get involved. But it's essential to say that this doesn't mean that governments need to tell their citizens what to eat or remove choice in any way. Governments are already involved in shaping the food environments within which their citizens make food choices, for instance, through subsidies, public procurement, and so on. And currently those systems tend to be very heavily weighted towards meat overconsumption. So what we need to do is rebalance those food environments to make it easier to choose lower meat alternatives. And here are a few sort of inspiring examples of how that's possible. So a sort of very soft way that governments can incentivize lower meat consumption is to change their dietary guidelines. And for example, China's dietary guidelines a few years ago set out to halve the country's meat consumption. And more recently, Spain implemented dietary guidelines of just 0 to 3 portions of meat a week as being the healthiest option that fits within the planet's boundaries. Another great option that's available to governments is public food procurement. And so this is, for instance, public institutions like hospitals and schools can take measures to reduce the amount of meat that they serve. And just as a great example, 11 hospitals in New York recently made plant-based meals the default option. So people could still choose to eat meat, but because plants were the default, this created a kind of nudge to increase plant-based consumption. And this was really successful and had a lot of customer satisfaction. And lastly, what we really need to see governments do is we're used to the idea of a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We need governments to coordinate something similar to lower meat diets in a way that's just and fair for both farmers and consumers. An example of a country beginning to sort of pioneer this approach is the Netherlands, which has proposed a kind of radical plan to reduce its livestock numbers by 1/3. In this case, to keep within nitrogen limits from the vast amounts of manure that are being generated by these farms. And some of the backlash from farmers illustrate the essential nature of implementing a just transition. And lastly, the Dutch city of Haarlem has actually banned some forms of meat advertising. So there are sort of harder forms of regulation that can be brought in too. So for the second part of this talk, I want to zoom in on private finance's role in defunding big livestock and why this is important. So we conducted some sort of pioneering research a couple of years ago that for the first time looked at how much the financial flows that were going into industrial livestock companies globally. We found that between 2015 and 2020, global meat and dairy companies received nearly $500 billion in backing from investment firms, banks, and pension funds headquartered around the globe. And to conduct this study, we looked at a list of the 35 biggest meat and dairy companies as identified by IATP, so companies like JBS, Tyson, Cargill, Fonterra, and others. These are really the biggest meat companies in the world. And for instance, to give you an idea of the scale of their market share, just the 10 largest meat and dairy companies account for nearly 1/3 of the world's chicken and a good chunk of other meat sectors, slaughtering nearly, with the capacity to slaughter nearly 32 million chickens, 500,000 hogs, and 120,000 heads of cattle a day. So these are the kind of core companies that we need to focus on. And just as an example, JBS, the world's biggest meat producer, is one of the biggest sources of emissions in the meat sector, and also is consistently linked to deforestation and corruption charges. So we looked at who the biggest financiers were of these companies, and we found that the biggest creditors, so that's issuing loans, underwriting bond issuances, and so on, were BNP Paribas, Barclays, JP Morgan Chase, and others were topping the league table for creditors. In terms of investors, so this is shareholders and bondholders in companies. We found that the top companies involved were BlackRock, Capital Group, and Vanguard. And you can see the others here. So why should investors defund cut-off finance to big livestock? Well, apart from it being the right thing, and as we've said, the need to reduce the environmental impact and social impact of big livestock, it's also a financial risk to investors. So there's really only two options here. Investing in big livestock and its growth will lead to either climate crisis, which will affect the stability of all society, including the financial sector. And as Changing Markets touched on, the livestock sector will also potentially face stranded assets as it's sensitive to climate change. Or the alternative is that financial risks and stranded assets will occur if the industrial livestock industry is scaled back within environmental limits, as it must do to keep us within safe limits of climate change. Investments also cause significant reputational risk, harming business. And it's important to highlight that for most finance, industrial livestock companies will make only a tiny proportion of their business. So it's financially immaterial defunding these businesses in the most case, and comparatively easy to cut ties with compared with fossil fuels. It's important to note here that the alternative, you might be thinking, why not keep investments in these companies and engage with them? And we think there's a number of key reasons why this won't work. So the main reason being that big livestock companies, like fossil fuel companies, their core business is a polluting industry. So they face losses and stranded assets if livestock production is reduced, and will fight fiercely to stop this happening. And we can see evidence that this is the case because none of these industrial meat and dairy companies have targets to actually reduce meat and dairy production. Where they do invest in plant-based foods, they see that as additional to continued livestock growth. And many of them are actually fiercely lobbying against policies to reduce meat production and pumping out misinformation about downplaying the impact of meat and dairy. Another important consideration is that many big livestock companies are closely held. So the majority of the shares are owned by a few individuals. And this means that minority shareholders, even collectively, have limited influence. So we think it is a better focus for investors to engage with retailers and caterers who won't, whose core business isn't tied to the meat industry, and it's more possible for them to switch procurement practices to less meat and dairy without it harming their core business. And finally, why defunding big livestock is effective. So it can deflate big livestock's share prices. It can increase big livestock companies' cost of capital through looking for loans, etc. And it also erodes big livestock's legitimacy, creating reputational damage that can help build pressure for the regulation of big livestock. So these are all really valuable things we can do to phase out this polluting industry. We've been very much inspired by the fossil fuel divestment movement, which has shown huge success. So nearly 1,500 institutions globally now, representing nearly 40 trillion in assets, have already committed to going fossil free. And now investors will come under increasing pressure to divest from big industrial livestock too. As you can see here, there's already beginning to be reputational risks to being associated with this polluting industry, and protests are growing around the world to incentivize divestment. So just my final slide, looking at some of the positive examples of where this has happened already. So for instance, Australian Ethical, which has 5.4 billion in funds under management, already has a policy of not investing in large-scale commercial animal agriculture. The Volksbank, which is the 4th largest banking group in the Netherlands, managing 37 billion in savings, has a policy of avoiding investments in livestock farming because of links to issues of food security, climate change, biodiversity, health, and human rights. And there are also examples of companies sort of divesting from individual big livestock companies. So like Nordea Asset Management recently divested from JBS over to Forestation. And Legal and General Investment Management, which is Britain's biggest asset manager, divested from industrial dairy company China Mengniu Dairy in 2021 over their insufficient response to climate change. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. We're really keen to engage with investors who are interested in defunding and divesting from industrial livestock, and also any campaign groups are interested in helping raise pressure. And yeah, really looking forward to the debate at the end of this session. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that very strong case to divest and defund the industrial livestock sector. Shifting over $500 billion of investments and finance from the past couple of years is not a small task, but the fossil fuel divestment movement has shown that it is possible to mobilize finance. So we'll do our best to do the same with the livestock sector. I would now like to open it for questions to the floor. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring you the microphone.
Thank you to the speakers for those great presentations. Mine is a quick one to Martin. Hopefully, Martin, you can hear me. My name is Tozi Zokufa from the Coalition of African Animal Welfare Organizations based in Cape Town, South Africa. Just wanted to find out of the work that you have done, have you picked up any investments, meaning industrial animal agriculture investments on the African continent? I know when it comes to cattle, for example, one of, in fact, the biggest cattle ranch, if I can call it that, it's in South Africa, and it's run by the Khan brothers. I just wanted to find out if there's any other investments. I've heard something from South Korea in Uganda, some Denmark, maybe pig production in Malawi. Is there any information that you might share with us? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the question. Well, so I'm afraid this is maybe something I can't answer so much off the top of my head. So, but as I say, the companies that we focused on was this list of the 35 biggest companies, and many of these are kind of multinational companies. So I would be astounded if some of them didn't have some operations in Africa. That's definitely something that we can go away and dive in. And if you're interested in looking into in more detail, we can dive into the data set. However, the important thing to mention as well is that we're planning on doing follow-up research to this. So that Butchering the Planet report was a couple of years ago. We're commissioning follow-up research now. We're planning to expand the range of companies that we focus on. So if you have a particular interest in companies that are operating in Africa, please do get in touch, and we might be able to look through those lists of companies and sort of pick out some of the most appropriate ones for you and help you look at who's financing those projects. So yeah, sorry not to be more concrete now, but we can certainly help you dig into the data sets and try and help you in the future.
If I can just add to that, the Stop Financing Factory Farming campaign is also working on a website where we will publish a database with information of the development banks that are financing livestock projects around the world. So it's not ready yet, but hopefully in the next few months, we will be publishing that and you will have access and be able to research a quite comprehensive database with information about the finance of development banks. Are there other questions?
Thank you. My name is Joe McFadden. I'm an animal scientist at Cornell University, and I have a question about efficiency. There's a lot of focus on methane emissions. Certainly from you, maybe you could respond, or others could as well. When I look at efficiency around the world in the developing nations like India, in India, there's 10 times as many large ruminants as in the United States. About half of those are buffalo, half of those are just crossbred animals or indigenous breeds. And in that situation, the efficiency in America is about 12 times as better than in India. And so when you look at it on the methane intensity, especially on the unit of energy corrected milk yield, is far worse in India. So my question is, when you look at conventional farming versus smallholder farming, why isn't there more emphasis on smallholder farming as a way to lower total methane emissions across the world? I'm not saying that deforestation is not an issue, it is. And especially I look at total emissions, Brazil and South America is leading the charge, but South Asia is very close behind it. And it's predominantly smallholder farmers with low efficiency and high emissions per unit of milk.
I'm going to see if I can respond to the question. So the question was on efficiency, and what we're seeing in terms of the focus on the methane emissions, we're looking at what these transnational companies are doing. So it's quite different than what smallholders will be doing. So, and sometimes for dairy companies, for example, they definitely are cooperatives, and these companies usually will be, grabbing the milk from these cooperatives, from these small farmers sometimes. So this is still a change within that transnational company. What we're seeing right now is that the industry is definitely focusing on efficiency, on their emissions intensity. So how much milk they can actually produce from one single cow, but they're not really thinking about that life of a cow. How long is it actually producing those methane emissions from their enteric fermentation, i.e. their digestive system. These companies are not these transnational companies, and I want to keep making a focus on transnational companies that are the largest emitters, are not really looking at their absolute emissions. So how, of all the cows that they have, how are they actually going to reduce the emissions of all the cows that they have? They're only focusing of the milk that they're producing, the liter of milk that they're producing. And that actually, it's a clever accounting on how much their emissions are actually in fact real or not. You know, that's one of the things that we need to be looking when big companies talk about efficiency, because I don't think it's true accounting of their real emissions. I had another point, but I forgot about it. Maybe I'll come back to it.
Thank you, Alma. Oh, you had a question as well, right?
Hello, thank you to the panel. That was very interesting. My name is Alejandra Uribe, and I'm from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. And I had a question about like the campaigns, sorry. basically who's your target audience when you are doing a campaign? Because I just think that one of the biggest challenges when it comes to industrial meat is the lack, like the knowledge gap about the impacts of the livestock, right? And I think the fossil fuels, Martin mentioned that as well. There is a lot more knowledge and research out there when it comes to fossil fuels, and that's perhaps why it has gained more like climate finance, but food systems and agriculture, it's kind of is very much is very much left behind, and is not even included that much or specifically in NDCs. So yeah, how can you change through campaigning the narratives of livestock, and yeah, to kind of push for that change, when you consider that the lobbying power of these companies it's huge. So yeah, I guess this is a question for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to take that question? Milena?
Yes, thank you. I think it's a really interesting question, because basically what we want to do with this campaign is not only get or the attention of the investments, the public banks. We want to make the people, the entire people, make aware about the system itself that basically is worsening the rights of people who are trying to do something in a better way. So our public objective is, of course, are the banks. We want to make them more aware about the impacts that have been causing, that the companies are causing, because yeah, people can perceive these impacts more at the local level. So it's basically the people who are being, in many cases, displaced by the big industries just to raise animals or to plant this kind of food that the companies later will be using. So this is one of our, of course, our focus, but we want to also continue engaging with local people, with communities that also want to propose a different alternative to the food production. So the organizations that we are working with now in Latin America, in Africa, they also wants to use the campaign as a way to show how these impacts are affecting their rights, because these kind of issues cannot be easily raising in the countries. If you go to Brazil, to the Amazon Brazilian forest, you can just not say that you are against the GBS or Cargill. It's actually a really risky situation for them. So we want to use this campaign to raise these voices, to show how that people is really being impacted in their health, in their daily lives. The livelihoods of these people are really changed because the companies. And this is something that is not really visible, because what we can see in the websites or basically the propaganda that is being used is that, yes, the companies are doing something to reduce emissions, but this is not the objective of the food systems in general. What we want to raise awareness is that the food is not a business, that the food is what people basically needs every day to survive. And these kind of populations, local communities, women are raising so many challenges regarding to access to land, for example. So these kind of issues are like topics that we want to raise also through this campaign, that there is not only the investment, where is the investment going? Why we are not investing, or why we are not funding countries to improve the land titling processes? Why we are not investing in those countries like in Latin America, Africa, that really needs a transformation in the production systems, in the food production systems? So it's kind of what we want to do, but it's also a process. The campaign is something that we are constructing together. We are building together this. So this is why we also want to invite more people to be part of the campaign, not only civil society, but also, companies that want to do something different, because we know there is a lot of course, interest and a lot of initiatives to change the system is what we really want to push for, to change the industrialized system production in general.
Do you mind
Thank
if
you.
I jump in quickly on that question as well? And just to completely agree with everything Melina has just said, it's so important. One of the things that is important to note is that the fossil fuel divestment movement has been going on for over a decade now. And yes, we're less far along the road than that. The industrial meat divestment movement is comparatively young. But one of actually the main successes of the fossil fuel divestment movement was precisely this foregrounding of the fossil fuel companies. And we saw that, you know, for instance, companies like BP, they explicitly funded the creation of terms like carbon footprint as a way of trying to deflect attention away from the corporations that were profiting from fossil fuels and deflect blame onto individual consumers and individual behavior change. And I think through accident or design, we have a similar situation at the moment with dietary change, where it's almost always framed as an individual decision by atomized consumers. And it's very rare that the corporations who are pushing mass-produced meat and are lobbying for subsidies to be locked in for this overproduction of meat to be foregrounded. They're largely invisible at the moment. And part of actually the aim of divestment campaigns and the main benefits of them is that it brings these corporations out of the woodwork and puts them front and center and raises awareness about the negative environmental and social impacts that they cause. So we hope to raise awareness about the negative impacts these companies cause through media pieces, raising awareness, and also through regulatory pursuing companies for you know, who pretend to have deforestation commitments. Many banks will have deforestation commitments, but are continuing currently to fund these destructive companies. So there are ways that we can challenge greenwash through regulators very usefully as well.
Thanks, Martin and Milena. Are there more questions? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Lin from Buddhist Foundation. I want to have some comment on efficiency, because I'm a physician, and then we know that now the most prevalent diseases are non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, coronary heart disease, heart attack, and then all these diseases mostly the important risk factors are consumed too much meat, such as if you consume too much beef, then the cost will be higher, and then you need to get some medication, and then if you got sick, you need to do castration or cabbage, and this kind of health outcome is kind of we call external social cost. So for the efficiency of producing meat, maybe the efficiency of producing that meat is industrial will be higher, but it is only focused on how much meat you produce or the dairy you produce, but there's so much external social costs, including health costs. I don't know exactly the number of like a big livestock industry or the small farmer, the percentage of how much methane they produced to cause the increase of greenhouse gas. But I think that there's so much external social cost had not been counted. So if we count because when I see the patients, there's so many patients suffer from this kind of chronic diseases. And then now we call this livestock industry caused this kind of climate change issue, So there's some different kind of disease, new emerging infectious disease is also related to that, especially such as SARS or this COVID-19. Some is related also related to this. So I think that the external social cost should be counted. So the efficiency totally will not be that good for livestock industry. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very important argument, right, about the social and environmental costs of the industry. I think that's a bit about that links with the need to regulate livestock. Is this something you would like to comment on, Martin?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just coming back to the emissions intensity point, I think it's really important to point out two things. One is that, as I say, even the lowest emissions intensity livestock tends to have far higher emissions than plant-based alternatives. So there are sort of hard limits on how much efficiency gains can reduce emissions. Secondly, it's important to note that basically, although the emissions per unit are lower in intensive livestock, there are several trade-offs. One is that you tend to get lots of mass-produced cheap meat, and this increases the overall production of meat. So although your emissions per unit are going down, the quantity of units is going up massively. So whilst you get reductions in emissions intensity, you get an increase in overall emissions. And the second point is exactly as you expressed so well on the externalities. So intensifying livestock tends to come with all kinds of externalized problems and trade-offs. So although you get lower emissions intensity, you get other problems beginning. So yes, the externalized health costs of higher meat diets, but also in the UK currently, air particulate pollution, the biggest source of air particulate pollution, is now no longer transport, it's agriculture. And this is yet another indirect health impact that primarily livestock agriculture has. Also, intensive livestock leads, as we know, to more factory farm-like conditions and lower animal welfare, with associated higher risks of pandemics due to the poor conditions that the animals are kept in. So intensification comes with huge trade-offs and limitations. So yeah, completely agree with the question.
Thank you, Martin. Are there other questions? No, I would like to ask another question to Alma, because investors tend to prefer to invest in innovation, for example, rather than divest. And there's a lot of talk about technical fixes, like adding feed additives to the feed of ruminants, for example, to reduce methane emissions, using biodigesters and being more efficient. Are these solutions, can they contribute to actually reduce methane emissions, or are they false solutions?
I think at this point, we need all tools to use for the toolbox. We have found that technical solutions can only lead us thus far. A recent study that we conducted for the EU in particularly, so that, for example, feed additives can only give about 12% of emissions reductions. However, if we were to actually shift to healthier, more sustainable diets, can actually give us 25 decrease of emissions. So this is an area where, yes, you can take a look at different aspects, but at the end, we should be also not overlooking the potential of shifting our diets, becoming a little bit more aligned to national guidelines. And yes, there will be some of these technical fixes. At the moment, they are still tested, and it's something that we don't know if they're going to work in the longer term. However, dietary shift is something that it's not only good for the environment, but it's also, as we have been mentioning here, it's actually good for health benefits, as well as cost benefits, for anybody going into the pandemic and to the crisis that is going, economic crisis that is going, it's also going to be helpful for that. So.
Thank you for that. Are there other questions? You again.
Thank you. Yeah, I just heard about the Premier of New Zealand. They're going to tax on livestock industry. So this kind of we divest from the large industrial livestock company. So I don't know, is there any effect, or is not still working on it now? So maybe I can ask the comment of you from the government tax because of the methane. But now, because of that kind of pressure, financial pressure, so they even put some ingredients in their feed, so they can reduce the production of the methane from cows. So I think this kind of also this is a way that we can urge or encourage livestock industry to have some innovative idea how to reduce methane production of methane emission from livestock industry. Yeah, I don't know what's your opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Alma just commented on that. I'm not sure if you would you like to add anything?
I don't know if I understood correctly, but you were talking about New Zealand recent introduction of the methane tax, is that correct? And how companies are using now feed additives to actually reduce this. And I think it is connected to the comment that I just made about technological fixes. So feed additives are part of that. And one of the things that we have been hearing from different presenters, either here at COP and in other webinars in the past, is that feed additives is something that at the moment they are being tested. There have been shown some potential of reductions, but it's something that we still don't know how they will work in the longer term, right? That's the important thing that we should actually be thinking about. And one of the things that I've been hearing is that the system of the digestive system can actually become or get adapted of this feed additive, and the emissions actually reductions can actually be lower at a later date, cannot work the same way at a later date. So that's something for us to keep in mind, and that's why we shouldn't actually just go immediately to technological fixes, but we should also be looking at what are the potentials of shifting our policies to push for more healthier diets. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, you have a question, and you'll be the last question, and we have to wrap up. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Peter Elwin from Planet Tracker. Not so much a question really, but just to agree strongly with what Alma and Martin were both saying, that I think if we use technology solutions as the first step, that's the wrong path to go down. We get a much bigger shift from a planetary, from a dietary, from a health, from a climate perspective by actually changing the shape of diets around the world and moving more away from industrial livestock. But there will still be a place for meat. A lot of people are not going to want to shift to a vegetarian or vegan diet. And then we can make the meat industry more efficient from a climate perspective by using some of these technical additions as well. But as Alma has said, some of them work, some of them are a bit untested. And the other thing it's worth bearing in mind is these large companies, if you allow the technology solution as the first step, they will take that. They won't cut their production. They will raise their production using the lowered methane footprint, and they will carry on producing more industrial livestock. So I think shift first, tech second would be my advice.
Yes, definitely agree with that. For our last question.
Thank you. So the regulation, certainly in the United States, is going to happen eventually. I'm fully anticipating that in my lifetime. I'll see that in terms of methane mitigation on farms. But the concern regarding technologies is a real concern, because these additives, like you said, there's real serious concerns about adaptation. I would even take it a step further. Things like bromoform, 3-NOP, not so much, but seaweed especially. There's some safety concerns to the animal. There's safety concerns to the human because the bromoform in milk is potentially carcinogen. But there are other opportunities, other innovations out there, but it's going to take time to get those tested and approved. And there's going to be ones that are safe. And so regulation is important probably in the long term, but we really got to make sure that the technology is there to give farmers the opportunity to use the technology to meet their required thresholds. So I would hope that with any regulation conversation, there's also conversation about tech innovation that's sort of going along side by side. And I just want to make a comment to the gentleman over there. You know, in India's unique example, I've learned a lot about India the last couple of months. It's been a personal passion of mine because they produce so much dairy over there. And they have 100 million farmers over there. And a lot of the clear majority of them are using about a quarter of all the milk they use for their own nutrition. So any influences in efficiency are going to certainly impact the livelihood of those farmers, just simply because that's their main source of nutrition. So if we think about how that changes in the long run, we really got to think about not only what is their source of nutrition, how's that going to change over time, but also their prosperity in their communities. That's also going to be influenced. So thanks. This was a great conversation.
Thank you. We need to wrap up. So I'd just like to pass the word to each of our panelists for final comments and final remarks, starting with Milena.
Thank you, Meryl. So yes, just my final comment is just to, inviting you all to continue with these dialogues. I think are really interesting and all of us are learning from each other. So it's a process that I think is necessary. If we want to transform the system, is my call again, we just need to transform how we are producing and what we are eating every day. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to Alma.
Yeah, I just want to leave you with the message of not overlooking the livestock emissions, the methane emissions produced by these large companies. I think this is something that we shouldn't forget. And they actually outpass some of the oil and gas companies. So I think having these discussions, keep having them after COP, it would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, would you like to make a final statement?
Yeah, thanks so much for the discussion, everyone. It's been really interesting. And just to reiterate, we'd love to continue these discussions. If there's any investors in the audience who'd like to discuss sort of defunding and divesting, very happy to support you. And likewise, we're always looking for other groups ranging from experts to NGOs to collaborate with and building the evidence base for this issue and raising pressure. So please do keep in touch. I'm sure you can get contact details from the organisers, but you can reach me at martin@feedbackglobal.org. And yeah, thank you so much once again. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you to our dear panelists for this very interesting discussion. Thank you for the audience with the many, many questions. It was very enriching. And I'd also like to echo the call to continue this debate. And if you want, please, if you're an NGO or a movement, please join our Stop Financing Factory Farming campaign, which is focusing on development banks as the Stop Financing Factory Farming. Thank you all.